So from a personal point of view, I'm hoping that today's speaker can do the same for shipping markets. Anna Pao Soman is the advisory professor of Shanghai Jiao Tong University and Tongji University. She is the eldest daughter of Sir Y.K. Pao, the great Hong Kong shipping tycoon, who with an initial capital of 20,000 Hong Kong dollars went on to build the biggest merchant fleet the world has ever seen. Sir Y.K. was also the driving force behind the early formation of Dragonair and Hong Kong institutions such as Wheelock Marden, Lane Crawford, and the Wharf Company were all part of his extensive empire. But in addition, he was an unofficial diplomat with unrivaled access and influence with world leaders, notably Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher. Anna's book, Y.K. Pao, My Father, chronicles the life of Sir Y.K. and gives an insight into many of those key discussions. Please welcome Mrs. Anna Pao Soman.
Ladies and gentlemen and friends, I was a little bit nervous, I must admit, coming here to speak, because by the sheer name of this venue, it was a bit daunting. I'd like to know amongst you how many have connections with shipping? Quite a few. I better know what I'm talking about, because I'm sure you know more than I do what my father did. But, and I'm sure you wonder why I started writing a book. I was told I'm just a novice in writing books. I never wrote before this book. But one reason is that I realized my father's friends were fading away one by one. And so I thought I'd better put it all down. And second, I like the next generation to understand him. It took me a lifetime to understand this man, whom I thought, well, just another successful businessman and so on. But it took a long time for me to realize there's something more than just what appears on the surface. And of course, I need to record this very spirit of Y.K. Pao. The end of Shanghai, before it sort of collapsed, and I call it the fin de siècle, was a very interesting time. There's a certain romance when we talk about old Shanghai to all of us. There's a nostalgia, there's a mystery about this city. And my father was part of it. Read The Banking Days of Y.K. Pao in that book. But he came to Hong Kong, and as Tim had said, with some $20,000 in his pocket. He came as a banker. Unlike many of the Shanghainese who came to Hong Kong, they were in textile industry. But he turned his hand on import and export business. And actually, it was quite interesting because he was transporting soya bean from South America to China. He was a very pragmatic man. He didn't question who received the soya bean. It was Guang Da Huang, and so he just sent them. But we learned much later, I only learned in the 80s, that part of it went to the communist underground army. And Hong Kong was then an entrepot city, so it was befitting that he was doing this import and export business. But little did this sleepy fishing village dream in those days that one of those poor immigrants was actually trying his shipping skills, which was zero. He knew nothing about shipping. But in 1976, Hong Kong was put on the map, on the world map, because in Newsweek, the cover page said, King of the Sea, Y.K. Pao. He then had the largest fleet in the world. And correct me if I'm wrong, I was told it was second to the Russian Navy. And it was like more than 3 times of Onassis shipping fleet. He stood worldwide, held 13.5 tons, and Onassis was 4.4 tons. It's very well known, and I'm not going to talk too much about his first ship, which was a 16,000-ton third-hand and could even be fourth-hand coal burner, which he named Golden Alpha. It was small enough to be moored in Hong Kong Harbor, and I had the fortune to be invited to climb onto it, and literally climb onto it by the rope ladders. And that was when I learned my first lesson of life. I was scared stiff because the ship was slightly moving and the rope moved. And my father said to me, look at how that sailor went up. What the boys do, you can do. Then in 1962, father built his first new ship in Hakodate shipyard. I don't think it exists anymore, in Hokkaido. And it was an 18,000-ton log carrier. And it was quite a memorable journey when I went on it. Had to do my daily exercise on all fours, crawling along the logs with gloves and spikes in our shoes. Pao's business model in those days was recorded as shikumisan, which meant that he was doing it as a banker, extremely conservative. In the heydays of shipping in the 70s, the early 70s, late 60s, in fact, the rates were changing every day. So it was very stupid of anyone who can think to fix their rate at a certain level and not fluctuate by the daily rate. But Pao went for a fixed rate and a long-term charter before even ordering the ships. A lot of ship owners ridiculed him and said he was a novice. He was a banker. He's really not a shipper. But he turned out to be absolutely right when Suez Canal opened again. And tonnage was there was this oversupply of tonnage, and cargo was reduced, and a lot of shipping companies actually went belly up. But he was still afloat with his fleet. As early as 1980, he reduced from 220 ships to 70 ships. And at the height of his business, he actually owned 500 ships. For somebody who had built a company from zero to 500 ships and having to let them go, he was unsentimental. He was very pragmatic again, and he managed to survive. Worldwide Shipping was talking about globalization way before, I think, Harvard Business School coined that word, in the late 60s. Y.K. Pao actually had offices as early as that, dotted about London, New York, Tokyo, and he built up a team of very international technicians, onshore staff, as well as offshore staff. Now, this was not easy because he didn't even go to university. He didn't know a word of English. He taught himself English by a tape recorder. But he was running this business in English because every morning he had his operation meeting in English. That's the only way he could even communicate with his local staff because he never learned Cantonese. He was the first Chinese chairman of Intertanko, which was predominantly North European. I don't think in those days even the Greeks were included in this organization for the private ship owners. Father was the first Chinese to sit on HSBC board, and he was the first chairman, non-executive chairman of HSBC. He was succeeded by Helmut Sohlmann, my husband, and both on the board as well as on the holding board. Now our eldest son, Andreas, is on the Hong Kong board, and the business has been succeeded by our eldest son, Andreas. Y.K. Pao was the first Chinese to take over a British hong, as Tim had mentioned, Willock and Wharf. And I don't need to go into that because so much has been written up on that topic. He was also the first to actually get on to acquire the Dragonair, and that is another separate sort of story, which, please read the book. I'd like to talk about how he got into diplomacy. As the shipping business is very international, that took him around the world. And this man, who's so full of energy, he seemed to have not enough to do. So he started meeting all these leaders around the world. He talked about free trade, he talked about market economy, and he talked about the inevitable development of beyond communism. He found years by many leaders, especially by Reagan, Thatcher, and foremost, Deng Xiaoping. Now, I have to tell you how this man, a little bit beyond the surface, he's a very compassionate man. And I didn't realize that until later, what everybody was telling me afterwards, because in the boardroom, in his operation meeting, which I had sat in, he was so unsparing. In front of all colleagues, he would have reduced them into mere decimals. He would pick up mistakes by 2 places after the decimal. By just flipping his eyes, he could work out a sum much faster than 3 or 4 calculators. In those days, they didn't have the calculators. But his heart was huge. Almost everybody who asked him for help, he just gave without questioning. He was giving a car each year to the Save the Children Fund. He gave to, of course, you can see that his name in universities, his swimming pool at Aberdeen, and many other charities. But one thing we didn't know until much, much later, in the 90s, was the story that through an intermediary, somebody in China asked him to contribute an airline ticket to fly his son, who has been crippled in the Cultural Revolution. He didn't know who it was. He just didn't hesitate and said yes. This young man who flew to Canada for treatment turned out to be Deng Pufang, the son of Deng Xiaoping. Our family didn't know this story until the 100th anniversary of Deng Xiaoping, which was celebrated in Hong Kong, and Deng Xiaoping's daughter, Deng Rong, went up to the stage and talked about this story. I never heard it before. So this man, actually, he did a great deal. Constantly in China, I get people coming up to me and say, your father was so great. He helped me out. He did this. He did that. Stories that weren't publicized. Early in 1968, Father told me that China was going to open up and develop. Actually, I remember that date distinctly because that's a year I got married to my Austrian husband. It was hardly conceivable then because China was in havoc with the Cultural Revolution. The whole country was immobilized. People were demoralized. Nobody dared to talk. And you walk across the street, even in Hong Kong, some of the mainland people, they pretended they didn't know my father. And they walked past because they don't want to be identified knowing this capitalist. I have a story. When he gave his first donation to China for the hotel. In those days, there wasn't enough international hotel. So he gave this Zhaolong Fan Dian, which was named after his grandfather. So you would think somebody gives the country some money. Well, thank you very much. But for a year, there was no sound of it. He didn't hear anything. Then he checked up. Then he realized that they don't know how to receive this check because it's a check from the capitalists. And a socialist country cannot accept a capitalist sort of dirty money. So he went to ask Deng Xiaoping what was going on. Deng Xiaoping said, never mind, I will receive the check, and I will come to your opening, and I will make sure this hotel is going to be built. So Deng Xiaoping did come to the opening. Actually, that picture in the book is in the president's suite of Deng Xiaoping came to the hotel opening, that picture. And that was the first time and probably the last time Deng Xiaoping attended the opening of a hotel. But this hotel was given to the country, so even when my friends want to stay there, I would have to pay for it. Father made his first visit to China in the late 70s. The emotions of returning to his motherland, his hometown, hopefully are captured in my book. Pao met Deng in 1980, as late as 1980, for the first time. Father usually took me along, and I was able to witness these great conversations. And both are very excited and enthusiastic, and they were connecting very well. But I was always puzzled how that could happen, because one was speaking Putonghua with a very, very heavy Sichuan accent, and the other one had a Ningpo accent. But somehow their eyes met, and they knew their wavelength was on the same level. Our families became closer and closer. In fact, my father wanted to help the shipping industry in China. He formed the first Chinese joint venture company. It was made up of Worldwide Shipping, China Shipbuilding Corporation, and Sinotrans Company in 1981. It was named the United Shipping Company. It had to be approved by the State Council, a process which was quite laborious in those days. But by this company, Father managed to educate a whole group of shipping people, and they got international contacts. We had a branch in Hong Kong, and it was mainly, they were just shadowing worldwide staff in learning about shipping industry on the international scene. Then when the Sino-British negotiation over the return of Hong Kong to China came to an impasse, Father intervened using his close connection with Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher. And I'll tell you a story which I did tell last night. The story about the skipping rope. He took me and my husband with him to see Mrs. Thatcher. And before the meeting, he was told by Sir Percy Cradock and Lord Howe, President Lord Howe, at that time he was Sir Geoffrey Howe, that they gave up on Mrs. Thatcher. There was no way they could convince her. She was in her head full of the victory of Falkland Islands. So she was not going to face up to the inevitable destiny of Hong Kong. But we went along, and Father took a huge box of gift. And Helmut and I were very deferential, but we said, well, this is corruption. Let's read this huge box. So he went into her office and said, I brought along early Christmas present. Mrs. Thatcher said, oh, no, we cannot receive gifts, especially that size. He said, open it, and then you can give it back to me if you don't like it. So he opened it. It was full of just tissue paper and a skipping rope. And she was laughing her head off. She said, whatever is that for? And he said, well, being the leader of a country, you need to stay very healthy, so you must learn to skip. I skip 100 times every morning. I give that to Reagan. I give that even to the Pope. So with this sort of mood, then he started being very serious. So Pao said, well, the real present I brought you is the order of a ship. We have already signed our contract in Austin and Pickersgill, which is about to close down. Because in those days, there were a lot of industrial action in the shipyards. They were not getting enough orders, and shipbuilding was definitely falling behind Japan. And Korea was just on the rise in shipbuilding. So with that, Mrs. Thatcher was so moved because she was on the verge of sort of closing down all these shipyards. And that would mean a lot of unemployment for the workers. So father said to her, it's really a business losing proposition for me to order the ship from you. The British shipbuilding was never on time, always industrial action, and the standard is not as good as some of the newer countries who had newer equipment, more efficiency in their team. And if delivery is delayed, of course it meant that business on the ship would be delayed. So it's really not businesslike to order a ship. But he said, that is the little I can offer as a British citizen because I hold a British passport. So I am going to sacrifice my business for the country. Mrs. Thatcher was very moved. He could have kissed her. She could have kissed him right away. But father was very quick on the uptake and said, I have two conditions. One condition, you launch the ship. That's fine. At Austin and Pickersgill, she went. And that's the picture you saw on the left with Mrs. Thatcher. That is the ship naming ceremony at the British shipyard, Austin and Pickersgill. Then she said the second condition is you come to Shanghai. I have another ship, very similar, being built in Shanghai. He said the real reason I want you to come to Shanghai is whenever you go to Beijing, you go in an official capacity. And so you face all the diplomatic people, and they have to take a certain official stance. So all you know is the facade of a country. I want you to know what's going on. I want you to see the people. I want you to meet the people in Shanghai away from all these political officials. So that was difficult proposition because she had with him, Mrs. Thatcher had Sir Charles Pole, who was his personal assistant. And of course, being a leader of a country, you do not support the heavy industry of another country. So as a rule, one doesn't go and name ships for another country. But Mrs. Thatcher said, well, if you have sacrificed your business, I would make an exception. And she agreed to go to Shanghai and name the ship. And that was the memorable trip. She went to Shanghai and subsequently went to Beijing. And she was persuaded because all along the trip, Pao had different ways, in his very charming, charismatic way, told Margaret Thatcher there was no choice, absolutely no choice, but to give up Hong Kong. However, Pao also had a very strong hand in persuading Deng to preserve all the British interests in Hong Kong and in China in those days. So China actually, in the reunification, in the joint declaration, actually there is a lot of protection for British interest. The fate of Hong Kong was thus sealed by these three great men and a lady. And they have all passed away. But what we've got left here is something, is their spirit. And especially Y.K. Pao, his life was, by nowadays standard, was very short, 71 years. What he left behind was his pioneering spirit, his can-do spirit, his ingenious creativity, even with the skipping rope, in his diplomacy, in his business, his compassion for his fellow men, his upright morals, because in the company, anybody gambled. He took great pain having people watch who goes into the jockey club. He said if that staff appears near jockey club more than 4 times a month, out with him. Because gambling, womanizing, and even smoking, he considered all these vices. He left behind him his positive attitude, his pragmatic approach, and above all, his sense of humor and charisma. A lot of these are the values of Hong Kong people. And I would like to, through the journalist's mouth, how we can be more positive about Hong Kong now. What we have in Hong Kong actually is an economy which is doing much better than most other parts of the world. We have opportunities right north of us. Today's South China Morning Post talk about even charities, old people's home going across the border. We have this flexibility. We have a lot with us. I was very moved when I saw a few young Hong Kong people in China, and they are trying to be new entrepreneurs, setting up businesses, trying to overcome a lot of difficulties. And here I can't help mentioning my son Philip, who's one of those young people going north, going back to Shanghai, where when in 1949 I was held by the hand of my father coming to Hong Kong and make a new life here. Here now, he is going back to Shanghai, built 2 new schools in Shanghai, a school which is a non-profit school, and we founded the school in 2007 in celebration of my father's 90th birthday and the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the return of Hong Kong to China. Yes, in every household, there's a lot of issue. We all run a household. Now tell me, how many households you don't have things that go wrong? Leaking windows, for one, when a typhoon comes. And Hong Kong, of course, have a lot of problems. But I think it is so important to remember the 3 R's we teach, Philip and I teach our children at our school. It's respect, responsibility, and reflect. I think we're not reflecting enough in Hong Kong now. Can we do more about positive actions about environmental protection instead of demonstrating against certain measures, which is inevitable? I don't want to change. If you look at my telephone, it can go into a museum. I don't want to change because I don't want to create rubbish if I can. If everybody can do that in your technology, not be upfront there, I'm sorry if somebody comes from Apple or any of these companies, because 好倒米啊, I'm just reversing the trend. But I think these little actions are far more important than being negative. What we don't realize is a lot of people now take their children on marches. It's correct because you do teach them how to confront an issues, but too much of it also get our mood down so much. So we need to be more positive, more responsible, more in things that we do say and we put across to the people. And anyway, I do a little, I can't help, I can't restrain myself from this school of coming up to 6 years old. It is a bilingual school. It combines the best of the East and the West because we actually use the Chinese curriculum. So we are internationalized Chinese school. So we use the Chinese curriculum, but turn it into IB later. And we have now 900 students, and we are on 2 campuses. And what we try to uphold are some of the values of YK Pao School, and our motto is to work diligently, use sparingly, and exercise persistently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. We've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, and I think, Florence, you want to shoot off first. Otherwise, please just put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating story. But if I could go back to the actual theme of today, which is as the vision of your father and then Xiaoping being realized for China and possibly for Hong Kong to that matter, I'd be very keen to hear. What was his dream basically for China and maybe for Hong Kong too? And how far is it from reality?
I think, as I was saying, in 1968, my father envisioned China opening up. In early 80s, when I went up to Beijing, we saw mule pulling carts along the road, bicycle. I'm sure all of you know that even in late 80s in Beijing. And I was very skeptical about the modernization of China. But my father was very optimistic. His vision, which he shared with the great man Deng Xiaoping, was actually a consumer-driven economy. So he said to Deng in those days, he said, well, now your cups, and he pointed to the cups, you know, usually they sit there and there's a cup of tea, there are 2 cups of tea, the rest don't get any. But he actually said, you realize the cup are being distributed from the central government. You're making work for yourself. And you're paying all the factory workers. So in very simple terms, he actually explained, if you put enough money in every single person's pocket, they go and buy the cup, and they will drive the economy. They will pay the factory workers. And he predicted in those days, he said, you will see one day your shops are just sort of flooded with consumers coming in to buy the cup. And he was so right, because in the late 90s in Beijing, some of the shops, we did see that scene. Everybody was rushing in to see some new line of products. And now, of course, you can see this is realized. They are even in our shops.
Anything further? Okay. Florence is going to shoot again.
Sorry.
He's
Yes. Then someone on the floor first.
oh, behind. Yeah, no, sorry.
Well, then I will ask about his relationship and his comments on Mao Zedong. Your
My
father?
father?
Yes. How did he see what was happening there, and did he ever comment openly about it?
Yes, he did. In one of the meetings, he actually said to Deng Xiaoping, he said, well, China's, you know, you're the boss. Why is Mao Zedong's picture in Tiananmen Square? And Deng said, we're not like Russia. We don't take down Stalin. We'll always remember Mao Zedong is our founder of modern China. And his picture will forever be in Tiananmen Square. And you can still see that. But I don't think my father met Mao Zedong.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much. Where we got? Oh, we have actually, sorry, out of my line of sight. Just over in the corner.
Hi, Jing Chen from Forbes. My question is about if your father were alive, what do you think he would think about China today? Would he be happy, or what kind of, would he be make any suggestions?
I think he would be very happy that the wealth had actually trickled down to most people. he would be sad that there are certain parts of China which are still in sheer poverty. But he always reminded me in those days, he said, it takes time. China is a huge country. He would be very happy with the infrastructure, how it sort of, the roads and all the, it's much easier, and airplanes of course, it's much easier for the leaders to go to these small places and to see what's happening compared to the old days. He would not be happy to hear the news about corruption. He would definitely frown on that a lot. But as early as 1970s, in 1980s, he actually said to Li Chuwen, who was in Hong Kong in the Xinhua news agency, he actually said to him, he said, that's the one area you've got to remind the leaders to be careful, is the corruption. He said there is, he saw probably little signs of that, which prompted him to say that. So that's one area. But I think he'd be generally very happy that it's an economy which is more market-driven.
Okay, well, we've gone past our witching hour, so it only remains to me to thank Anna Powell-Sayman for coming. I hope the FCC has not been as intimidating as you feared. Always like I get to leave some memento. It's not a skipping rope, I'm afraid, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank
It's
you.
been a great pleasure. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and I hope we'll have the pleasure of your company again in the not too distant future. Thanks very much.